Yesterday we talked about episodic memory. We now come to another interesting type of memory in the long term storage, what is called as autobiographical memory. These are the memories about event and experiences of one's own life. So, basically when you ask people, they will be able to recollect specific life experiences. When I was in class 5th, when I went to the boarding school, when I came to my institute, my first day in the hostel, my first day on the railway station, my first journey all alone in the train, in the flight. So, there are certain specific life experiences that you are able to recollect, and of course, there is a possibility that you could also interpret those events. Now, autobiographical memories are primarily image based personal memory of those events which are not repeated. Say for example, I was driving and met an accident. Now, this accident is a personal life event that never got repeated in life. It happened only once, but then I have the image of that very experience. So, what did I experience when I was on the driving seat and was about to hit the vehicle coming from the other direction? This is completely image based personal memory. There is also a possibility that autobiographical facts could be similar to personal memory, but they are not image based. And then of course, you could have generic personal memory of repeated events. So, for example, if you have a very strong memory of your own house, the lane that leads to it, how where is what in the house, okay, these are the generic information pertaining to your personal life. Factors that affects other forms of memory also affect organization of the autobiographical memory. What is also interesting in autobiographical memory is the infantile amnesia. For example, if I ask you what is your name, it is very easy for you to tell me what your name is. If I ask you, do you remember your childhood days, and you say yes, I have some glimpses of it, but then if I ask you your own life experiences of the first 2-3 years of life, it is impossible. We are not able to do so, and this is called infantile amnesia. We basically show the inability to remember the events of the first 2-3 years of life, and little later we have only the significant experiences that we are able to retain with ourselves. One interesting mechanism in autobiographical memory is related to some very what you call as surprising and consequences based events. Brown and Kulik in 1977, they came forward with what is called as spatial mechanism hypothesis, which says that spatial memories of events are there which have extremely high level of surprise and consequences attached to it. Okay. Now, this is of course one type of autobiographical memory, where you are able to recall the location, the date, the time and the imagery. So, basically what you have is a vivid snapshot of moments, and remember one thing, that these moments are full of surprise, and also you know the consequences of this, and therefore, they are retained as a flashbulb. We have heard Don Cohn's recollection of the Vietnam War. Earlier it was recalling an episode. Now, listen to him once again.
I
was in the army. I was a military reporter, but I was also a fighter, a soldier on the front protecting his homeland, carrying a camera like other people carry guns.
So, these are phenomena of vivid memories of extremely important events, which need not be very accurate. What is important is that the recall of what one abstract from the experience is more important instead of the situation itself. Therefore, consequences become important here. In 1984, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, the then Prime Minister of India, was assassinated. At the time of assassination, 4 or 5 people were along with her, and her personal secretary was also along with her. Now, his personal secretary, Mr. R.K. Dhawan, long after his experience of Indira Gandhi's assassination, when he was asked by a news channel to narrate his experience of that very moment, This is what he said.
31 सवेरे जब मैं प्रातः सवेरे रोजमर्रा की तरह मेरे ड्यूटी पे 8 बजे जाता था, जब मैं गया तो उस वक्त इंदिरा जी अपना हेयर ड्रेसर को बुला के हेयर कट करवा रही थी। उस वक्त उन्होंने मुझे 2-4 बातें करने को कहा जिनके ऊपर मैंने ध्यान दिया। जैसे ही हम चर्चा करते गए आगे बढ़े तो एकदम देखा, जब सिर उठाया तो बीरेंद्र सिंह था जो सिविल ड्रेस में था, अपने रिवॉल्वर से उसने गोली चलानी शुरू कर दी उनके ऊपर। इंदिरा जी तुरंत उस वक्त गिर गई। अभी गिरी थी तो उसके ऊपर जो सत्संग यूनिफॉर्म में था, दिल्ली आर्म पुलिस से था, उसने अपने स्टन गन से गोलियों की बौछार कर दी। गोली चलाने के बाद बीरेंद्र सिंह ने और सतवंत सिंह ने अपने हथियार फेंक दिए। एक्चुअली उसने बीरेंद्र सिंह ने अपने रिवॉल्वर फेंक दिया और कहा हाथ ऊंचे खड़े करके कि मैंने जो करना था कर लिया, आपने जो कुछ करना कर लो, बाकी लोग सिक्योरिटी वालों से अफसरों से करो।
You can now see the personal significance of the event and the consequences makes Mr. Dhawan remember the details 25 years after the incidents. Memory of unexpected and highly emotional arousing events are there in our flashbulb memory, and the major determinants are personal significance. Something which has significance for me might not have significance for you. Consequentiality, what were the consequences? The more dire the consequences, higher is the chances that you will be able to retain it. And how much is it emotionally charged? The higher the degree of emotionality, higher the degree of emotional arousal, the more are the chances that you will be able to remember it. Several times in the history of mankind it has happened that a historic event has taken place and there were handful who have witnessed it. Listen to this lady who was victim of communal riot twice in her life. Once when India was born in 1947 and again in Mumbai riot that took place in December 1992 and January 1993.
पुलिस आई, दरवाजा खटकाया, बोला भी सरकार आया कि नहीं आया, बोला नहीं आया, बोला कि उधर नाक पर उधर चाकू मारा किसी ने उसको, तो अभी एडमिट हॉस्पिटल में, जज हॉस्पिटल में जाओ तुम देखो। सन 47 में हमारे माँ बाप मर गए थे। सन 47 में जो झगड़ा हुआ, छोटे छोटे हम बड़े हुए, मैं 2.5 बरस की थी, अब बड़े होकर हमारा ये हाल।
We have also heard Van Bou, the Vietnamese civilian photographer, in the previous lecture. When he was shown one of his own gloomy photographs of the war days, the recollection of the event was strong enough to reactivate emotion in him.
When I look at these pictures, I feel so hopelessly sad. To make these pictures is very difficult. When you took these pictures and you knew you had these pictures, sunlight.
Bức ảnh này là bức ảnh đau khổ, tàn khốc, chết chóc, mất mát.
This is a hard-hitting picture about pain, cruelty, and death.
This is called flashbulb memory. Another form of long-term memory is semantic memory. Semantic memory are organized, structured record of facts, concepts and our skills, and basically we have the retention of abstract knowledge, meaning of the words, symbols, ideas and of course, the rules that relate those. This memory system stores general knowledge that are not associated with specific places and time of acquisition. Remember, what was actually distinct in episodic memory was that it was specific to place, date, time of acquisition, whereas semantic memory is not attached to time and space, rather it is more about the general knowledge that you derive from that experience, and therefore, it is a network of nodes and each node represent a basic concept. When we organize our semantic memory, the important things that play a role are semantic networks, concepts, prototypes and exemplars. Semantic networks are actually the knowledge that represent meaningful relationship among concepts. For example, when you look at the network here, you have living, animal, and then you have several other attributes. You have mammals. Mammals are animals and they are of course living. Sheep is a type of is a mammal, is a type of animal, is a living creature. Ships also have fur, and the fur is shared by polar bear, which also is a mammal, which also is an animal and which is also a living animal. And then polar bear lives on the snow, whereas ships doesn't. Now, this is how you finally have the semantic network. Whole lot of concepts, they are actually they form a network, and this knowledge that you have, they are actually semantically networked, and based on the network you derive the knowledge about a particular concept. This is called semantic network. Concepts are mental categories that are used in the organization of the objects or events, and then we have the prototypes. They are the best representative of the categories, and therefore, the most suitable example of any given concept that readily comes to your mind is the prototype. For example, most of the students in or most of the human beings in north part of India, if you ask them what is the image that comes to your mind when you listen the word tree, and this is what you get. Now, on the right hand side you have a much more freehand sketch of a pencil of a tree, but on the left hand side you just have a line drawing of the tree, and this represents the prototype. So, the most suitable example of a tree that comes to your mind is the prototype of the tree. This is meant by prototypes. And then we have another interesting thing in semantic memory, that is exemplars. When you are told a category, say insect, which insect hits your mind the first? Here, for example, you have the grasshopper that comes to this child's mind. You are told a means of transport, and the one that comes to your mind is a bicycle, for example. So, these are exemplars. I have a student of mine working on exemplars and categories, and it would be nice if we listen from her own experience of how children they categorize things and what are the exemplars that she have been able to collect.
When we talk about an exemplar generation task, basically we are asking participants to come up with different items, list out items that they think belong into different semantic categories. And what I have done is, I have asked children aged between 3 and 9 years to tell me what they think comes in 30 concrete semantic categories. Now, when I talk about concrete semantic categories, basically I was interested in those semantic categories where the items could be represented by pictures, and I have these semantic categories which I would be listing out a few of the categories here, like birds, body parts, clothing, fruits, gift items, hospital items, wild animals. Some are superordinate categories, some are basic level categories, and some are subordinate categories. Now, I will be sharing with you a few of the exemplars the children have come up with. Typical response for this child was peacock. Now, there were a series of responses which were given. The first one was peacock, and I had taken down the first few responses that were given within the first 30 seconds, and I continued taking down the responses till the till 2 minutes got over. Now, the basic idea was to know children who were 3 years of age, what kind of a first response would they come up with in the first 30 seconds, and also see what are the common responses for each particular age. Let us say the kind of responses a 3-year-old child would give would be very different from a 9-year-old child or 9-year-old children would give. Now, the second response was parrot, third sparrow. Now, this way I had around 4 responses that were given within a period of 2 minutes. The first 2 were given within the first 30 seconds. Now, let us go to the second child, second participant. This child is also 5 years of age. Now, for this child, the first response was a very general term in Hindi called chidiya, which means a bird. Now, second response was again in Hindi, batak, because these children were bilingual. Some of the responses were in Hindi, the others were in English. The third response was sparrow. Now, this is where the first, the 30 seconds got over, and I continued, then I got a response which is cheel, which means eagle. Now, this way I got around 8 responses from the second child. Now, when we are talking about exemplars, basically we are trying to find out the best example of a particular category. Now, by doing this, we would know the ones, the most prototypical responses given by children, and also the responses which are frequently given by children of a particular age. Now, what I have found is children who are older, they tend to give lot more responses compared to the younger children. The reason for this could be that they have lot more instances of semantic categories stored in their memory. The second reason could be the rate of articulation. Now, and another observation that I have made is children who are very young, they tend to give very idiosyncratic responses. Sometimes they are very irrelevant to the category that is given to them, and this could be that this could be because of the fact that semantic categories develop over a period of time, and hence certain categories might not develop, you know, at that particular age. So, the boundaries are not very clear, and hence children have problems you know, defining the boundaries of the categories, and hence we have idiosyncratic and very inappropriate responses. To give you an example, okay, a child might say give responses such as elephant, monkey, deer for domestic animals. Okay, and another child when asked to name weapons probably would come up with things which are totally, you know, irrelevant and incorrect, such as tomato, potato, carrot. So, this clearly tells us that the boundaries of certain categories are not very clear, and hence children have problems. Now, this exemplar generation task is concerned with understanding the internal structure of semantic categories. Now, when we are talking about internal structure of categories, basically we are talking about best cases of category membership. Now, should we look for the boundaries of semantic categories when we are talking about class inclusiveness, or should we just go by the best representative of that particular semantic category, that is the instances, items or entities that best you know, represent that particular category in terms of attributes. Now, research has said that even though children and other individuals, they are not very clear about class boundaries, they would be very clear in terms of what comes under each category. So, when you ask them about exemplars, they would be very clear, even though the boundaries of the categories might not be very clear.
Let us now discuss how memory is organized in the long term memory. Organization of information in the long term memory is very, very subjective. You cannot prescribe a format that this is how you should be organizing the information in your long term storage. Images of information could be concrete or it could be abstract, and of course, one can very easily make out that concrete words are very easy to learn compared to abstract words. And usually the methods for organizing information into the long term memory are either you cluster the information, you code the information, or you break the information into chunks, and then the significant chunks you store with yourself, and this is called clustering, coding and chunking. These are the processes adopted to organize information for your long term storage. Interesting phenomena that is also observed in long term memory is the tip of tongue phenomena. Tip of tongue is actually a phenomena where if I ask you something, so what is who is the person whom you met last evening, and you say yes, 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 and you know that you have the name with you, but you are not able to reproduce it at that point in time. This is called tip of the tongue phenomena. It is there with you, but right now at this point in time when you are asked to recollect it, when you are asked to retrieve it, you just fail to do so. This is called tip of tongue, and this is an interesting indicator to suggest that the search process in long term memory is not random. So, actually what happens, the much better you organize information in the long term memory and the better retrieval cues you provide to yourself, the higher is the probability that you will be able to retrieve it when asked to do so. If you make a random search, you just fail to do so. Now, in the long term memory, we have already discussed, we have the declarative memory and the procedural memory. Declarative memories are very, very explicit, whereas procedural memories are implicit in nature. Procedural memory is the knowledge and skilled behavior. So, when you acquire a skill, okay, gradually what happens, you develop control over that process and the whole behavior becomes very, very automated. You must have seen mechanics repairing the vehicle. Okay. Now, any mechanic who works that way knows how it has to be done. When you say for example, when you cycle, you just sit on the bicycle and start pedaling it. Okay. You know the entire procedure, when to apply the brake, when to swing it in the forward direction, when to move it in the backward direction and so forth. This is procedural memory. So, declarative memory basically is the what of the facts and the events.
ये second knob है, ठीक है, ये MA है knob, ये KB knob है, ये सिलेक्शन बटन है, ये फर्स्ट knob है, फर्स्ट में रूटीन वर्क एक्सरे करते हैं, सेकंड knob है, सेकंड में फ्लोरोस्कोपी है एंड थर्ड knob में बकी एक्सरेज है एंड फोर्थ knob वर्टिकल बकी है.
Procedural memory talks about how of the procedure, and procedural memory of course is implicit, and it is the knowledge of how the task is performed. An interesting part in the long term memory is prospective memory, which refers to failure to remember what an individual concerned was about to do. So, basically it is your inability to remember the intended action, and mostly it is the older people who show this problem. For example, you plan to do something, and then while you leave the place to execute the task, you forget it. Now, look at this image. When we talk of prospective memory, okay, we can of course think of the retrospective part of memory. Retrospective memory would be something like, say, this man thinks that okay, today I submitted documents to the bank. So, he wanted to take loan from the bank and he submitted the required documents. You have already executed the task. This is your retrospective memory. You remember what you have done. Now, the moment he comes out of the bank, he says, now I plan to get 2-3 grocery items, and he moves to the grocery shop, but then out of the 3 he could remember only 1. There is some loss there, but there could be a possibility that on the way you thought 2-3 other things also, and what you planned you forget it. This is called the loss of prospective memory. So, for example, you plan to call somebody in the evening, that okay, right now I am very busy, today in the evening I will call my father, I want to talk to him, but then in the evening you are not able to do so. Most of the prospective memory situations are cue based. So, you use cues there. For example, putting particular paper on the table to remind that there is something that you have to do the next day. This is something that I mostly do in my office. I will just leave whatever has to be done and definitely done tomorrow, I will put it on the top of the table, so that tomorrow morning the moment I come to my office, I see those papers and I can recollect what I had to do. For example, I know a family member of mine who will always keep the medicine close to the lock, so that when he goes out and locks the door before going to the office, he does not forget that he has to take medicine that day. Now, these are the cues. When you leave medicine near the lock, when I put the paper on the table so as to remind me what work has to be completed the next day, these are all the cues that we leave. So, prospective memory is basically a situation wherein you just know you are able to execute a task, you plan it, you intend to do that, but while you go halfway, you forget what you were planning to. Let us look at this video to get a better impression of what prospective memory is. This is prospective memory. Till now we have talked about the sensory, the short term and the long term storage systems, and let us make a comparison between these 3 basic types in in memory systems. The sensory memory, of course, we talked about it in detail. We talked about iconic and the echoic memory. We would primarily make this comparison on the basis of certain parameters. So, the first parameter is the approximate duration of these 3 memory systems. In sensory memory, iconic memory, its lifetime is just 1 to 2 seconds. For echoic memory, the lifetime is 4 to 5 seconds. For short term memory, the approximate duration is 20 to 30 seconds. Whereas, long term memory, it can last for days, months, years or lifetime. Now, in terms of capacity, sensory memory is of course relatively large, at least 16 items can be accommodated in sensory memory or probably much more. In short term storage, it is relatively small, but then it increases when one starts using the chunks, and about 7 chunks it can be accommodated. So, 7 plus minus 2, we have discussed the magic number, and therefore, the capacity will relatively although it seems small, it can be increased if one uses these chunks. And for long term memory, of course, the capacity is unknown, we do not know the limit, and it is very large, it seems. In terms of transfer of information, sensory memory, attention and recognition are important, only then these information will be passed on to short term storage, and these are the items that are retained and recognized moves to short term storage. Whereas, in the case of short term, we have discussed the maintenance rehearsal and the elaborative rehearsal. Now, once items that are appropriately rehearsed, they only will move to long term storage, otherwise these items will not move to the long term system. Whereas, memory content that are stored in the long term system, they are not supposed to be transferred anywhere. So, it is not applicable here in the long term storage. It is only that whenever one needs the information, when one makes an attempt to retrieve it, at that time long term storage content they are made usage of. Now, the type of information that are stored, if we try to compare these 3 memory systems on the basis of that, then sensory memory basically is the copy of the input. So, whatever you have, iconic, echoic, haptic, so whatever you have, it is just the copy of the input. Whereas, in the case of short term memory, we have the sounds, visual images, words and sentences. So, here it seems that even when you have the words and sentences, it might not actually be the exact replica of the input. When you look at the type of information stored in the long term system, then primarily it has meaningful sentences, life events and concepts. So, you have the meaningful content of the sentence, you have your own life experiences, and you have a good number of concepts that you are pretty comfortable with, a certain number of images, and of course, your semantic and the episodic memory. Now, we have seen in the memory system that information is lost from all the three systems. So, what are the reasons for the loss of information? From sensory memory, it is basically the decay of trace. So, if you process the information, if you pay attention to it, then of course, the information passes on to short term memory, otherwise the trace gradually has to decay, and this is the primary reason for loss of information from sensory memory. From short term memory, basically it is the displacement of old information coming into the short term storage, and therefore, what would happen here is that once you go for maintenance, rehearsal and elaborative rehearsal, rehearsed information will pass on to the long term storage, whereas new incoming information from sensory memory will always displace the older information that is stored in the short term storage. And then of course, in the case of long term storage, the reason for the loss of information could be faulty organization. When you do not stack the information properly, you give inappropriate retrieval strategy you adopt, and you have interference. We will come to these things when we come to forgetting. There we would discuss inappropriate retrieval strategy and interference. Let us talk about memory in children. The effects of memory distortion and construction are more pronounced in children. They are more likely to commit errors in reality and source monitoring. So, if you ask a small child to describe one single event, the child can come forward with multiple types of descriptions, and that is primarily because the child has no distortion and construction. These two processes will be very pronounced in him or her. Now, Bartlett did a very interesting study where he talked about reconstructive memory. Now, he came forward with several short fables, and the War of the Ghost is the most popular example talked about in psychology.
One night, two young men from Ugulac went down to the river to hunt seals, and while they were there, it became foggy and calm. Then they heard war cries, and they thought, maybe this is a war party. They escaped to the shore and hid behind a log. Now canoes came up, and they heard the noise of paddles and saw one canoe coming up to them. There were 5 men in the canoe, and they said, "What do you think? We wish to take you along. We are going up the river to make war on the people." One of the young men said, "I have no arrows." "Arrows are in the canoe," they said. "I will not go along. I might be killed. My relatives do not know where I have gone. But you," he said, turning to the other, "may go with them." So one of the young men went, but the other returned home. And the warriors went on up the river to a town on the other side of Kalama. The people came down to the water, and they began to fight, and many were killed. But presently the young man heard one of the warriors say, "Quick, let us go home, that Indian has been hit." Now he thought, "Oh, they are ghosts." He did not feel sick, but they said he had been shot. So the canoes went back to Ugulac, and the young man went ashore to his house and made a fire. And he told everybody and said, "Behold, I accompanied the ghosts, and we went to fight. Many of our fellows were killed, and many of those who attacked us were killed. They said I was hit, and I did not feel sick." He told it all, and then he became quiet. When the sun rose, he fell down. Something black came out of his mouth. His face became contorted. The people jumped up and cried. He was dead.
A group of students were asked to read this story about North American Indians. The story was reproduced after passing through several mouths. Almost all details related to American Indian culture were omitted and several others were rationalized. Each narrator added something to the story from his or her own imagination. Few details of the story was revealed, making it very simpler, and some other facts were exaggerated. The story got changed in the entire process. This is what he found. Now, we have another interesting example of reconstructive memory, the work done by Durganand Sinha. What he did was, basically he looked at rumors in the Indian setting, and that was this work was with respect to communal unrest, and later on J.P. Das and R. Kanungo, they also did an interesting study where they took two groups of students belonging to two different castes, the Brahmins and the Kayasthas, and they were given 4 lists of adjectives. Now, list 1 had adjectives describing Brahmins in favorable terms like nice, good looking, clean and so forth. List 2 had adjectives describing Brahmins in unfavorable terms like rude, greedy, fat, etc. List 3 had adjectives describing Kayasthas in favorable terms, and list 4 had adjectives describing Kayasthas in unfavorable terms. Now, the result showed that everyone remembered more unfavorable adjectives than favorable one, and it suggests that in general people prefer to remember bad rather than good attributes. Bluma-Zeigarnik, a Russian psychologist, compared memory for tasks that were successfully completed and those which were not. In fact, she interrupted the work and did not allow them to finish it, and this was just to ensure that there are tasks that remains incomplete. Interrupted tasks were remembered more frequently than those which were completed. This was the finding that she had. Now, this mismatches with our daily experiences. We have another interesting example from our Indian setup. Datta and Kanungo gave a new interpretation to Zeigarnik effect. They said that the intensity of emotion aroused by the completed or the interrupted task is the critical factor. Any activity that gives rise to strong emotion, be it pleasant or unpleasant, is remembered better than ordinary everyday action. Let us now talk about memory construction. Memory construction actually refers to recall of those events that actually did not take place. Now, it could be either memory implantation, or it could be because of high degree of suggestibility that somebody has modified the content of the memory that you are trying to pose before others, and these of course need not be deliberate. So, memory implantation actually is a type of modification in the memory because of the misinformation that is given. For example, after experiencing an event, when individuals are exposed to new misleading information, the recollection of the actual event, it gets distorted. And there are of course several cases of suggestive interrogation, where the way you are asked the question actually implies that you have to reply it this way. For example, if I ask you, do you think, and then I frame the question, and if I ask it the other way around, don't you think, and then I frame the question, actually when I ask you don't you think, what is implied is that yes, you do think that way. So, this is what is called as suggestive interrogation, that when you ask somebody a question, the way you frame it, actually you are suggesting answers to the individual. And there are of course several cases that are known where the clients have sued the consultant psychiatrist for implanting some alleged experiences. There were cases of childhood sexual abuses, there were cases of several other types of such experiences which the individual actually had not experienced, but was deliberately implanted in the therapeutic session, and later on when it was exposed, those consultants were brought to the court of law. Whereas, when we talk of memory distortion, we talk of the change in the content of recall, as the result of internal or external factor. So, actually what happens here is that you have stored the information, you have the memory of it, but then it gets distorted when you are trying to recall. So, the content will not remain the same. And of course, the factors that contributes to this are cognitive biases, suggestive questioning, schemas and motivation. So, you are cognitively biased towards something. Say for example, when you love somebody or when you hate somebody, this is a bias that you have. It is of course an emotion, I am not talking of the emotion, but basically your tendency to always look positively towards somebody whom you love and always look at the negative dimension of somebody whom you hate. Now, this is a bias that you have, and therefore, if you come across some negative thing of somebody whom you have deep appreciation for, you have a love for, you have an acceptance for, then there are high chances that you will gradually this information, the negative information will gradually erode out of the memory. Okay. And therefore, you have a cognitive bias to only retain the positive aspects of that individual. And then of course, you suggestively question somebody, basically you are guiding somebody what to memorize and what else to not do so. And in this process, basically you help somebody lose certain content, and this is called as suggestive questioning. And of course, your schemas, know how best you have memorized things, the schema that you have of this, and how motivated you are to distort the thing. So, if you have somebody for whom you have a general bias, you do not like that individual, or you do not like a set of individuals, you have a bias towards nationals of a particular country, or somebody belonging to certain ethnic group, caste, creed, whatever it is. Now, if you are so, then you could have a deep motivation within you to forget something. You deliberately distort the content, okay, simply because you are motivated not to memorize the positive part of it, or you are motivated not to memorize the negative part of it, whatever it is. Mood also has to do with memory, and mood can serve as an internal retrieval cue, and we have mood dependent memory and we have mood congruency effect also. So, if you are in a given mood state, it basically helps you, internally, it gives you certain cues which helps you recall things much better. For example, if you are very sad, you are very depressed, you are just very down, in that given state, if you try to memorize more and more things, the chances that you will not be able to do so, or if at all you succeed, you will be able to recollect only the sad aspects, sad episodes of your life, that possibility increases. Now, this is time for us to recapitulate whatever we have discussed with respect to human memory processes.